Hello everybody and welcome to Gwiglet. This is a brand new YouTube channel dedicated to English exam success at GCSE, at A-level and English beyond. I am a teacher of over 10 years experience and today I will be talking through exam success and understanding Macbeth. Our first lesson is context and background. So, without further ado, let's begin on what is one of the most popular texts studied at GCSE. So, a little warning before we begin. Knowing the context and the background to any text does help enhance your understanding, but it can never be an adequate replacement for understanding the plot itself. I tell all my classes that the most important part of any text is knowing the plot. You have to understand the plot, the way the plot progresses, and the key points in any plot, as well as characters and themes, as I mentioned also on this slide. Context is like the icing on the cake, okay? It helps you to understand the societal attitudes and values of the time, and it helps support your understanding of a text. I've always found it's an interesting way in because it helps give you the feel of the background of why the play was written or why any given text was written in such a way. However, it's not a substitute for such parts as your plot, key points, characters and themes. So do remember that. It's a nice way in, but it is a supplementary supporting aspect of the wider understanding of any given text. So, in this lesson we will cover three specific aspects of Macbeth, and they are the origins of the play, the time the play was written and performed in, and as well as this, how this knowledge combined shapes an audience understanding both then and now. We have to appreciate as a reader, whether you're a student or someone who just enjoys the texts, the values and understandings and ideas that we have as an audience are fundamentally much different to those of the early 17th century when Shakespeare first performed this text. And the ideas that come with that also have to be considered. So, let's begin with the origins and influences behind William Shakespeare's Macbeth. This is one of William Shakespeare's many tragedies. As you may already know by now in any of the lessons you may have had, Shakespeare had many different genres to his plays. He would have had his tragedies, his histories, and his comedies. Shakespeare's tragedies range from Hamlet to Othello to Romeo and Juliet and King Lear. Macbeth is the most commonly studied of the plays at GCSE, and it also is believed to have been first performed in around 1606 at the start of the Jacobean era. This is the reign of King James I of England, or the 6th of Scotland. For those of you who've ever had history lessons, this is the very end of the Tudor era. Elizabeth I has just passed away. King James, the newly crowned King James of England, has just taken the throne. And this is a time of upheaval. This is a time of a lot of societal change. Now, Shakespeare is believed to have taken his inspiration for the play from the depiction of the real-life Macbeth from the 11th century. A real historical figure derived from a text called Holinshed's Chronicles, a history of England, Scotland and Ireland. Now, the play does differ in a lot of respects to the original source material, both in terms of how Macbeth was as a real person compared to how he is in the play. It's very much like how you see in a lot of the films these days with based on a true story. You know, you take a grain of something or a small idea and then the idea is often made more entertaining, and in this case is no different with the play Macbeth. As well as this, King James I was believed to have been an ancestor of Banquo, and is a possible reason behind the play's creation, as Shakespeare looked to carry favour in the new Stuart court of King James I. King James I also had a lot of different interests that the play ties into, which we will cover later on. Now, society at the time. Society in 1606 was vastly different to how it is in 21st century society. And at this point in the lesson, we're going to consider 5 separate aspects. They are religion, the supernatural, the role of women in society, violence and the attitudes towards violence, as well as kingship. So, society at the time Macbeth was first produced. Religion. attitudes and values towards religion were vastly different. Contextual society, i.e. the society of the time that Macbeth was first performed, would have been deeply God-fearing. Okay, society on large would have attended church. Whether they privately held different views would have been another matter. However, what would have been important is to have at least have been seen at church. Okay, you had to be seen as God-fearing. Okay, this is a time before the English Civil War. This is a time where the divine right of kings still holds truth, that the idea of the monarch, the king or queen, had a direct connection to God, which is really important. Now, the aspects of heaven, hell, and judgment of one's soul were deeply important en masse in Shakespeare's time. We live in a more multi-faith, almost secular society in that way now. We have to remember that in Shakespeare's time, Christianity was the predominant religion, and with that came a genuine fear of the fate of one's soul, as we see with Macbeth himself, how he fears he's cast his soul off to hell for the murder of Duncan, for instance. The ideas of heaven and hell, where someone was buried, had a deeply important significance and symbolism in Shakespeare's time. As I mentioned just previously, the king or queen was viewed as the human embodiment of God. So, for example, we see this in Duncan, that Duncan is seen as how his virtues will plead like angels, as Macbeth says in the earlier parts of the play. This idea that he was, in his death, that society itself and nature, the very manifestations of nature from the trees to the animals, turns corrupt and almost poisoned in his death. And that shows how we have this really fervent, deeply ingrained and deeply held belief in religion. And you must consider this particularly when we read the play, and it really enhances our understanding. From here, we look at the supernatural and the beliefs in the supernatural at the time of Macbeth's first performance. Witches and witchcraft were taken extremely seriously at the time. We are only a few decades removed from Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, and the fear, the inherent fear of witches and witchcraft that plagued society in Shakespeare's time. If, for example, God forbid, a mother was to have lost her child in childbirth, it could have been commonly held as a witch's curse, for example. If a farmer had, for instance, lost their crops due to a bad season, witches could have been held responsible for that. There was a genuine fear that is so far removed from us in 21st century society, but one has to understand it if they're really going to understand Macbeth. Particularly, the very first scene is the witches. So we have to appreciate that we have to take it seriously because they took it seriously. Now, some instances of this in society at the time were seen in the Witchcraft Acts of 1604 and demonology, King James I's own published book. The king himself, I mentioned, had various other interests, and the supernatural was one of them. There was a belief that he, as a young child, he was almost killed in an accident that people said was created by witches, and he published a book, as I mentioned there, called Demonology, concerning witchcraft and the supernatural. Had a very deeply held interest in this. So it's little wonder why Macbeth, the play, is so shrouded in the supernatural, the witches, Hecate. So many different aspects there. With women, the role of women was vastly different then to how it is now, and expectations of women. In effect, women were the legal possessions of their fathers or husbands. They had minimal rights, and they were expected to be subservient to them. So they were effectively only seen in what ever their husbands or their fathers, depending on their age, would allow them to be. Violence. Now, violence and attitudes towards violence were markedly different. In Shakespeare's time, there was more commonly witnessed public displays of violence. You could have gone to watch animal fighting just down on the Thames. You could have seen executions in public. London Bridge would have had the heads of traitors cut off and stuck on spikes as a warning to anyone daring to question the rule of the king or queen of the time. So the idea of violence in public was much more common than it is today. On top of this, we have this idea of kingship and this notion of kingship. Now, In Shakespeare's time, a king was the public ruler in the same way we have a president or a prime minister in today's societies. The king or queen held that office of state in a much more powerful and much more influential way over their citizens. And this idea of kingship, the values and ethics and the act of being a king, was incredibly important to the ruling monarchs of the time. So we've had a look at these different aspects and these important points that will form an important part of Macbeth, the play itself. However, when we read Macbeth and when we study Macbeth as a play, we have to remember that there are two separate perspectives here to take into account. On the one hand, we have the text and how we analyse it from a contemporary perspective, how we, the audience or reader, react to the text now, how we perceive the witches, how we consider the acts of violence or the ideas of God, the afterlife, heaven and hell. But there's also a second way of reading this play and any text that is important for any student to understand. And that is how the text can be analysed from a contextual perspective. For instance, how the audience or readership of the time would have reacted to the text with their own privately held values or societally held values. Sometimes these can be extremely different, and in no greater example is that than Macbeth the play. For instance, let's look at the idea of witches and witchcraft. Now, in contemporary society, we commonly associate this with popular culture in more light-hearted terms. We look at The Wizard of Oz, we look at Sabrina, we look at different aspects where witches and witchcraft are taken into popular culture and they are almost given a more sanitized and less harmful and less threatening notion behind them. Right down to Halloween, the idea of dressing up as witches, being a part of that, is something that's come into effectively child's play and popular culture. That's how we would perceive witches and witchcraft in large. From a contextual perspective, witchcraft and witches were genuinely feared. They were believed to have brought danger and destruction with them. So when they first appear on the stage and they open the play with "When shall we three meet again," they create an element to a contextual audience, to an audience of the 17th century, of fear, of superstition, of danger that we commonly wouldn't hold. But nevertheless, as a student of Shakespeare and as someone reading or someone studying Shakespeare, it's important to remember that. Don't forget that. Just because we don't hold witches and witchcraft in the same level of fear and superstition and suspicion as they did in the 17th century doesn't mean it didn't exist. So when you're analysing the play, please do consider that as you go along. So that has been our first lesson. I thank you very much for watching. It's been really appreciated. Please feel free to leave a comment below. Also, please share this video to anyone else who you know may be studying the text, and please subscribe. If you'd like to also, there will be a Twitter account @GwigLit, and from then until then, I wish you all the very best and take care until the next video. Thank you very much.